Welcome, everyone. My name is David Andres. I'm the current president of the Society for the Study of French History. Welcome to this Douglas Johnson Memorial Lecture, the first one that we've held in these unusual online circumstances. But I'm very glad to see so very many people here with us now. Probably, I would say, at least twice as many people as has ever been able to attend one of these lectures before, which is great. The Douglas Johnson Lectures commemorate a person who was foundational, really, in the study of French history and modern French culture in Britain in the second half of the 20th century. And we're very honoured to co-host these lectures with the other society that he helped to found, the Association for the Study of Modern and Contemporary France. And just as a little sort of modern tradition that we now have in the societies in regard to these lectures, one of the things that the Society for the Study of French History does every year is to offer a prize for the best undergraduate dissertation in French history and announce that prize at the lecture. So although it is kind of entirely virtual and distanced today, I am very pleased to announce that this year's undergraduate prize has gone to Sarah Green from the University of Leeds for a dissertation entitled The Tuareg in the French Ethnographic Imaginaire, Using and Abusing Indigeneity to Articulate Colonial Identities, which was an exceptional piece of work and a very well-deserved winner of this annual prize. Before I turn then to introduce today's speaker, just one very small note that proceedings are being recorded. So if you don't want your face to accidentally potentially appear in the recording, do please feel free to turn off your camera and just continue to listen while watching, obviously. But there is a row of faces at the top, and you could randomly become one of them at any point in time. I'll be turning my camera off when proceedings start. But now, just to turn and introduce our speaker for tonight. Michael Brawes is a fellow of Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and Professor of Western European History in the university. His distinguished research career has focused on Napoleonic Europe, particularly addressing the expansion and imposition of Napoleonic Empire in the Italian lands. His book, The Napoleonic Empire in Italy, 1796-1814, Cultural Imperialism in the European Context, won the Grand Prix Napoleon in 2006. And in Napoleon's Other War, Bandits, Rebels and Their Pursuers in the Age of Revolution from 2010, he summed up a magnificent body of research on the deep-rooted conflicts of that era. Since then, he's turned to the production of a major and much lauded multi-volume biography of the Emperor Napoleon himself, publishing Soldier of Destiny in 2014, Spirit of the Age in 2018, and I trust more to come. I won't embarrass him by quoting any of the extensive praise that these volumes have received, but instead note that it is we who are honoured to have him speak to us tonight in the bicentenary year of Napoleon's death on the subject of Napoleon as a European, a certain vision of France and Europe. Professor Brawes, over to you.
David, thank you very, very much for those kind words. And after a build-up like that, I can assure everyone you're bound to be disappointed. It really does mean a lot to me to give this lecture. I always admired Douglas Johnson as a scholar, and it's a great honor to be here. I'd like to thank David, the Society, Andrew, for helping set all this up, and all of you for coming, for giving up the time. I would also like to apologize for the delivery of this lecture. I've had a certain number of voice issues over the last few months, probably doing too much of this. And I'm going to have to be reading this most of the evening, so I do apologize in advance. But okay. Napoleon always viewed the French with a certain sense of detachment. He was an outsider. Not only did he know it, he was rather proud of it. That did not mean he did not come to admire much in the French, still less that he did not come to share their meal. For this he did with a vengeance. But that he was overcome by an awakened Geist, something that showed him his true ethne, was never the case. Napoleon gave the French a sense of unity and purpose, some of them anyway, and they never entirely lost it. His achievements at home, the civil code, civil peace, when harnessed to his military victories, engendered a sense of what I think could rightly be called manifest destiny in many of them, that translated into an imperial ideal that transformed not just a country, but half a continent, the essence of which is there for all to see. Yet Napoleon never shed a certain detachment from the people he called his administrés. That famous regard of his was that of a clear-eyed outsider. Napoleon grew close to the French through shared experience. His process of assimilation had nothing to do with the romantic Maximian nationalism he is so often and so erroneously credited with fostering. His life was an exercise in Renaud's concept of civic nationalism. Napoleon was bound to France by the lived experiences of a stifling, unféroce regime, by the violent but liberating anarchy of the revolution, and later by the heady, if arduous process of empire building. It was through the experience of war that the cleavage between Napoleon and his country suddenly started to emerge. Napoleon remarked to Goethe at one of their two famous meetings that the price of liberation that the revolution brought was that the private sphere had been obliterated, that, as he put it, love and destiny were but politics. Now, Napoleon said a great many things, most of them calculated and self-serving, and this was probably no exception. A friendly warning to the author of The Sorrows of the Young Goethe that romantic self-absorption had been rendered obsolete by the bloody mayhem of the Bastille. Napoleon lived his life as politics. From the moment, I think, sometimes, from the very moment he set foot as a boy on the alien soil of France. His alienation from his schoolmates at military academy is well known. His estrangement from and resentment of his classmates was all too true. Even when the stuff of other myths, the famous snowball fight, comes to mind readily, is torn away. His loathing of a certain kind of French noble was all too real, enduring and indelible, even as he sought to rally many such to his regime and amalgamate them into his service. The bitter, violent Corsican nationalism of his school days was engendered in him by such people, but it was soon shed, like a snake sheds his skin, as Germaine de Stael would have remarked, had she ever called it to mind. But contempt for the kind of entitled boys in every sense who had provoked that Corsican nationalism remained in him forever. Marquises, he snarled at Caulaincourt on their sleigh ride from Russia to Paris in 1812. Marquises, their only place is on the comic stage. He liked Beauharnais. His contempt was not reserved for one class. The violent anarchy of the revolution aroused his contempt less for the barbaric ferocity of the revolutionaries, that could be channeled, than for the failure of the French to make a success of their revolution, so much so that they turned to a military authoritarian like himself. This only proved to Napoleon that monarchy was the only form of government that could cope with the French and that they themselves could handle. I think a line of thought traced brilliantly by June Burton in her book Napoleon and Cleo. The fact that, eerily like the Chinese, Napoleon developed a view of French history that there were cycles of dynasties. And when somehow the spirit of the age, as it were, slipped from them, there was a time of troubles from which emerged a new dynasty who would master the new age. And obviously for him, the time of troubles was the revolution, and the new age would be the dynasty of the Bonapartes. Monarchy was their natural state. And he deduced from this an element in Frenchmen that made them potentially a nation of lackeys. I have observed that the French are always ready to eat out of one's hand. They lack seriousness. Consequently, that quality impresses them most, he told Caulaincourt, among many others. What Napoleon never entirely grasped, because his point of departure was always the decadent Ancien Regime and the Hobbesian Revolutionary Republic, was the astuteness and dexterity of the French political elite. These were qualities lackeys needed to survive. Those of La République des Girouettes, so well discerned recently by Pierre Sermat. There is much to link Napoleon to Tocqueville. What the latter regarded as a grievous flaw in his countryman's character, the former saw, as an outsider, I would argue, as an opportunity to be exploited. It never occurred to Napoleon that these very people might have hired him and not the other way around. Marx saw it, Napoleon III and his nephew. I don't think Napoleon ever thought about that too much in himself. Early on his voyage into France, Napoleon discerned major exceptions to this mosaic of disdain I've painted it so far. The first encounter with a France he genuinely found agreeable was probably with the Clary family of Marseille, when he was still a young officer. Napoleon had a brief romance with one of the daughters. He dubbed her Desiree, it wasn't her real name. But that dalliance became a lifelong friendship. I think rather like Evelyn Waugh in this one thing with his fictional flits, Napoleon fell in love with the family, with the milieu that had produced them, rather than with any of their individual members. The Clary incarnated for him a wealthy, cultured France, enlightened, open to the world through both culture and commerce, imbued with a work ethic utterly alien to the stage marquises of the military academies of Brienne and Saint-Cyr. It is a sad comment in the whole Napoleonic episode that the Clary became as avid for aristocratic privilege and preferment as any Ancien Regime courtier. But at the time he met them, this opened a whole new France to Napoleon. It wasn't a new world. He came from a similar, if much more modest milieu in Ajaccio. It was a very particular kind of Corsican and a very particular kind of Italian. But he saw in them, in the Clary, something worth admiring. They were not the aristocratic boors and incompetents he'd met in the course of his education, nor were they la canaille, who had so terrified him when he ran into them in the streets of Paris on the 10th of August, 1792. No, this was something different. His admiration for the Clary stretched to the whole socio-economic group he labeled the masses of granite, the large, not so amorphous group of provincial notables, of military landowners and professionals, usually combining both. As the nickname suggests, Napoleon's admiration for them was NeoDarwinian. They had survived the storms of the revolution, and so had to be respected and catered for. Indeed, the representative organs of local government, which were far more important than has often been realized for the general running of the country, the raising of taxation, were built around these same notables, the masses of granite. The system of that taxation and finance, carefully constructed by those unsung heroes of the regime, Lebrun, Mollien, and Gaudin, gave them tangible security, as did the cadastre, the national land register, on which taxation was based, that was initiated under the consulate. The civil code enshrined their preoccupations as well as their values. From their ranks, Napoleon hoped a new generation of public servants would emerge as they passed through his lycée, his university, his Grande École, his military academies. The natural aversion to war of such people was something he repeatedly chose to discount, to ignore. In the end, I would argue, to his undoing, as they too swung with the wind. Like the practiced girouette of the revolutionary elite. As early as 1806, while wallowing in the aftermath of his great victory over Prussia, in Auerstadt, lording it over Berlin, delegations from the Senate and from the Paris Chamber of Commerce arrived not to crown the victor with laurels, but to ask him to end the war. He did not, for his values were never entirely theirs. Napoleon made one striking exception to his faith in the French bourgeoisie, the merchant class, especially those of the Atlantic ports and the Paris Bourse. He did not really mourn at the death of the French Atlantic very well, as Alan Forrest has recently charted so well for us. Embittered by the disaster of Saint-Domingue, which has seen his brother-in-law killed, his sister driven to a nervous breakdown, I think that's what we can only describe happened to her, which changed her personality forever, which seen the better part of a good army cut to pieces by disease as much as the rebels. Napoleon soon assimilated his aversion to this particular section of the bourgeoisie into a view of the world shared by many Frenchmen of his generation. He always felt these interests had pushed him into the expedition that he didn't really want to undertake. He always felt, from then on particularly, that they hankered for the old empire overseas, and therefore that they were royalist at heart, despite the fact that they were a polite and commercial people, shall we say. But here, I think, he touched a chord with many other Frenchmen. A hatred and fear of the world of boom and bust, of high finance, of global commerce. An unstable world in his eyes. The world incarnated for so many by perfidious Albion, the modern Carthage, poised and lurking to devour the masses of granite, and the métayers alike. This was a fear that had haunted the revolution from the beginning. You'll find it set out in impassioned terms in many of Sandra's speeches. It's a red thread, and Napoleon picked it up, and I think he picked it up earnestly. And in the wars to come, this hatred, admixed with bafflement of the British, proved a powerful bond between Napoleon and the French, almost to the end. It's always the card he plays. I think a very genuinely impassioned speech to the Senate in late 1813, when things really are coming to an end. This is the rabbit he pulls out of the hat. Defeat for us means victory for England. And what will that lead to? What will we become of it? What will we become if British commerce rules the world? The coalition powers have bought into this. They think it's going to work to their advantage. It won't. It's something he hammers on at again and again, and it's something that works for him again and again. It was a common thread. The power of this legacy lived on throughout the 19th century, best expressed maybe in the enthralling prose of Jules Michelet. It went on for decades, possibly forever. Do we want to be this? No, we do not want to be this. Then back me. Go on fighting. And through there, I think you see an important aspect of a certain idea of France that was widely shared. This was not going to be a desperately industrialized country. This was not going to be a place of dark satanic mills. This was going to be a country of small peasant farmers, of a wealthy, solid, middling class that was predominantly rural and professional. The twin heritage of a failed Ancien regime and a blood-stained revolution could be reconciled, or at least frozen, as Gwyn Lewis put it so well. But for Napoleon, the only real hope for France was not to be found in Royaumont and Amalgam, although they were the twin pillars of the consulate as the regime began. Indeed, they were. But they were a stopgap. The bringing together of the Ancien regime elite and the revolutionary elite of that generation was never going to be enough in his mind to build solid foundations upon. For Napoleon, the only real hope for France was to move on. De Gaulle's forgetting was for Napoleon unlikely and unworkable. These were old dogs with too many tricks up their sleeve, with a detachment of which only an outsider was capable. Napoleon quietly worked, he was quiet, over the course of the years to quietly ease that generation out. Where does the emphasis come? On education, on the lycée, on the Grande École, on the university, on the military academies. The development and promotion of a new generation. Completely new people, schooled in his ways, molded to his vision of France. A new generation, les enfants du siècle, who would be imbued with enlightened values derived from a post-revolutionary world, secular, technocratic, authoritarian, yet meritocratic to a very great degree. The old would never forget, but the young would have better things to think about. That was the plan. In many ways, it worked. Promotion was very rapid if one was able. Napoleon's faith in youth stretched well beyond the sons of the masses of granite, well beyond the casual. The army became more than the school of the nation. Napoleon's vision for his men reached far beyond the naive patriotism or sterile civisme of the revolutionaries. Napoleon saw, and I think you watched this when you watched the development of the army in the Channel Counts, very clearly. Napoleon saw a Gallic atavism in his raw peasant recruits that could make them into warriors. Torn from their peasant roots, estranged from their Catholic upbringings, the imperial army never permitted chaplains in the ranks. They were offered instead promotion on merit, a collective identity, and the prospect of gloire, something more than its translation glory, I think, can possibly convey. Napoleon sensed potential in the very same youths who had so recently resisted conscription by any and all means, who had often fought him as determinedly in their own way as the Austrians ever had. Napoleon saw, I think sometimes the devil's in the details for me, and maybe that's a bad thing. Napoleon saw the bayonet charge as the natural way the French fought. It combined elan and ferocity, collective effort and individual ardor. He hit the mark, but did so with when you read what he says, he did so with the detached eye of a Latin exploring the psyche of a Gaul. He was Caesar weighing up his former opponents. You know, he's not talking about his own countrymen. He's talking about this massive asterisks and obelixes that have come to him out of the depths of France. He's seen what they're like. He's seen their potential, and he's harnessed it. And Napoleon was seldom disappointed in his men. From their first forging in the Channel camps to their last stand along that same stretch of coast at Waterloo. Indeed, it was on the battlefield, I think, that Napoleon truly, unreservedly, came to love and respect the people he ruled. And it showed. French soldiers, imperial soldiers, were not flogged. The savage discipline of the armies of the old order was gone. Once in the ranks, the peasant levies were treated with a respect unknown in the armies of their enemies. The armies of the Republic do great things. This was still under the consulate, because they were composed of the sons of tenant farmers and smallholders, not rabble, was a sentiment he always flung in the faces of his adversaries. French troops were always the best. If defeated by armies he felt inferior, the Spanish, the British, never the Russians, it was the fault of their usually noble commanders. And here, I think, is a real window on that certain idea of France, and apologies to our friend and colleague Julian Jackson. You've probably seen that a lot of this is a kind of meditation on his marvelous book on de Gaulle. The army took pride of place on all public occasions right from the start of the conflict. And if you look at it in terms of a mise en scène of a Napoleonic journée, it usurped the place of the church. The church had always been prominent and come first on the Ancien regime. Now it was the army. That tells you something about the ethos of society. Some of Napoleon's most, I think, genuine outbursts, particularly on paper, come to his brothers. And I think he really means it when he says, "It was my soldiers who put you on your thrones. They gave you everything you have, not me. You refused to support the war effort. You refused to risk your people the way my people risk themselves for you. Everything is built on them. You remember that, you respect it. The army was his family. He had a country that was there. So many times you feel when things in his personal life are going wrong, especially when his first marriage to Josephine, when his brothers are playing him up, when there is, as it were, politics, because there is politics in the Napoleonic Empire, even though it's not elective. It's such a relief, such an escape to go back to the army. It was the army, the old guard, who first saw his son. No one else. The church took over the army's place. Pardon me, the other way around. The army took over the church's place in so many ways. The rather ludicrous national holiday he fabricated for himself, St. Napoleon's Day, which is the 15th of August, which is the Feast of the Assumption, was built around the army. It was a day when veterans and new conscripts were encouraged to get married with dowries provided by the emperor himself. That kind of thing is significant about what is to be held up as an example in society. The gendarmerie was one of the most elite corps of the army. It required the same level of attainment as the Imperial Guard itself. And it was hoped that the gendarmerie would provide a living example at local level of what France should be. Of course, it was a disastrous failure. The position of the army, as I say, is very revealing. There is another side to it too. The army was never allowed near politics. Indeed, it was never allowed near Paris. Only the Imperial Guard, the elite of the elite, who were always under the direct command of Napoleon and no one else, was allowed to enter the city. No one was going to do to him what he had done to everybody else that were there. No marshal ever held a ministry other than that of war, or was a counselor of state. The regime itself was resolutely civilian. The ethos of society was something else again. The affection, respect, admiration for the peasant conscripts was not felt for the families they left behind. But the Napoleonic regime was regarded as anything other than tyrannical by the mass of the French peasantry is a tawdry myth. It's amazing how many people so easily buy, who hate Napoleon, even so buy so easily into his propaganda machine. It's worth remembering. No revolutionary regime ever commanded the respect or loyalty of the mass of the French people. On only one occasion, that one time in the winter of 1791-92, was a call to arms met with volunteers. Ever since, it was conscription. And Napoleon's regime was no different. There were areas, I'm thinking particularly of Burgundy, where the peasantry had done well from the revolution and remained loyal to it, indeed remained very loyal to Napoleon to the end. There were areas with deliberately low conscription quotas because of that loyalty. Paris, because he was afraid of it. The west of France, because he'd given up on it. But his system of conscription was as relentless as it was efficient, as brutal as it was omnipresent. To the peasants who bore its brunt, the Napoleonic draft was known as the blood tax. There's nothing subtle about it. It involved a complex administrative machine, for sure, but it was carried out by the gendarmerie with the help of companies of veterans who would occupy villages, who would take hostages until Napoleon got what he wanted, his blood tax. Looked at another way when you delve into peasant life, Napoleon's rapprochement with the church was short-lived. Never listen to anybody who tells you that the Concordat was a success. His anti-clericalism expressed itself not through trying to destroy the church, not by holding festivals of reason in Notre Dame or smashing stained glass windows. His anti-clericalism expressed itself in trying to enslave that church, of jailing its leader. So often portrayed as the morning star of modern populist politics when you see it through the prism of things like plebiscites, and you see it through the prism of Napoleonic propaganda. It was nothing of the kind. The regime was profoundly elitist, sitting on an alienated hinterland. The enterprise of empire drew Napoleon and the French closer together than anything else, I would argue. Confronted with a plethora of others, confronted by hostility, presented with an abundance of possibilities for advancement, empire building did more to effect Graillement and amalgam, reconciliation and acceptance of the new order than anything else. Above all, it was here that youth found the challenges and rapid promotions Napoleon's grand strategy for his new regime so depended on. As the regime moved ever more overtly towards monarchy, towards dynastic rule, particularly from 1812 onwards, its cadre became even younger as the dangerous, uncomfortable postings of the empire in Italy, in Germany, in the Balkans, in Spain, allowed the young men who accepted them to move up the ladder faster than they ever could have in any other regime. Their careers were, of course, cut short in 1814. Stendhal became their most eloquent spokesman. Above all, when confronted by the other, whether that other be a feudal German noble, an enraged, deeply Catholic Italian or Spanish peasant in the mountains, or indeed the Dutch entrepreneur, the experiences and prejudices of the imperial marches melded easily together the leader and his imperial servants. And what emerged was not just a moral geography of Europe, it was, I'll talk about it for a minute if I may, but also, I think, a certain idea of France that became widespread and deeply rooted among the Napoleonic cadre, particularly among the young serving abroad. They were imbued with a cultural confidence, a sense of their manifest destiny to reform the peoples of Europe, to impose the unbreakable model, as they called it, on societies and polities they saw as backwards. The France they left at home. And I find this very amusing, even if they came from the Midi, even if they came from the West, it was somehow an urban France of the North and the East. Their France was secular in spirit, if not quite in practice. Alluvial not oceanic, a culture literary more than visual, where public service was valued more than private gain. It's how they measure everyone else they come across. The French imperialists did not revel in difference. They looked for people like themselves. In their own eyes, they found them in the Mittelstadt of southern Germany, certainly in Baden. To a certain extent among the Piedmontese and Lombard elites. Napoleon certainly felt at home among the Swiss. But it didn't stretch much further than that. There were exceptions. They found a great degree of support, whisper it not, among many of the Spanish political elites, and many in southern Italy. But their vision was such, it was clear. That, to me, is why Napoleonic imperialism could leave its mark in such a short space of time. The imperialists came with a plan. They came with a mindset. They were driven by a manifest destiny to bring the benefits of their revolution and also the glories of their ancien regime to everyone else. Napoleon spoke of it again and again and again. But what always strikes me in my own research is the way that this comes up from the bottom as well. These people will take a long time to come around. This is going to be a struggle. But they never give up. An insufferable arrogance. These young men were not likable. They had a vision. Here's this moral geography of Europe, of the feudal marches of the East, of the ignorant, superstitious, savage mountain Catholicism of the South. To the West, to the North, that commercial world which they so feared. And you can see their attitude to the British mirrored in their attitudes to the Germans of the Hansa forts, and indeed, from time to time, to the Dutch. These were the three marches which encompassed the core of the empire. And on these marches was the place where, in many ways, the revolutionary spirit was kept alive, fighting the old enemies that they felt had disappeared in France, but that were still there. The church in the Catholic South, feudalism in the East. Even young aristocratic prefects and procureurs were readily drawn into this vision of a French Enlightenment ruling Europe. No less than Latour de Pin, serving in what is now Croatia, was outspoken about, as he told them, the blood-sucking nobles, the vultures who squeezed the life out of this country. No one railed against the superstition, the obscurantism of the Catholic Church. More, I think, however, he tried to cover it up in his memoirs after it was all over, than the aristocratic prefect of Rome. But what also emerges, as I've hinted at before, is a certain vision of France, a France of the mind that they all came to share. It had its regional aspect too, and Napoleon, I think, it might have been imbued in his servants. He found it for himself. One of the most interesting things about him is that the minute he takes over as consul, even from he's back from the wars in 1801, he starts touring various parts of France. He goes to Normandy, very impressed by what he finds. He finds that world of the provincial notables, that right balance between that right perspective on commerce, on industry, and on agriculture that he likes. One of the first places he goes is Lyon, not just to sort out the affairs of the Kingdom of Italy, what would become the Kingdom of Italy, the Republic, but to sit down with the Lyonnais Chamber of Commerce, with the Lyonnais bourgeoisie, even in several cases with the silk workers, and work out what can be done. Because there's something of the entrepreneurial spirit he admires there in all classes. And Lyon, the second city of France, which had so bitterly opposed the revolution and never become reconciled to it after the terror and the Federalist revolt, not even under the Directory, gradually becomes, through, I don't have time to go into it, a ruthless policy of economic colonialism that he imposes on northern Italy, became one of the loyalist, one of the most dependable places in his realm. And when he fell, they quickly went back to their old ways. Set this beside his vision of Provence, which he had encountered in his first posting, major posting at Toulon, which he had come to despise as an unreliable hinterland during the Italian campaigns, the place where he had had his personal baggage and possessions pillaged on his supposedly triumphal return from Egypt. Didn't go down well. Provence, the Midi, didn't go down well in France or in Europe. Before long, the ever bloodier wars waged to build this empire. The cost, human and material, which fueled this manifest destiny, wound up not by uniting the French, but by driving a wedge between the masses of granite and the jeune cadre and soldiery who owed their identities and their prospects to exactly those wars. By the end, Napoleon had succeeded in creating a new division between the French. His institutional legacy proved indeed unbreakable. It's all around us. Nothing has yet destroyed it, not just in France, but wherever his armies triumphed for any length of time, and even some places like Spain and Portugal where they didn't. His vision of war and the cultural triumphalism imbued by his victories was not long in rising from the ashes in France. It took a generation, half a generation, but it was that was remembered. Yet as an outsider, I would argue, he never really reached into la France profonde. That sense of l'amour de construire and the stability this requires escaped him. Now, this is hardly to say, please don't get me wrong, that Napoleon would not still have been Napoleon, as Paul Schroeder might have it, had he been French. He had a powerful character, impervious to the wills of others. Nonetheless, I would argue, had he known la France profonde a bit better, had he once been part of it, he might have sensed the opposition to him arising from his policies a bit more keenly than he did. It was something that willful character chose to ignore. He was brought down from within. Oh, massive military defeat would have happened sooner rather than later, maybe in a matter of weeks. But what the Allies found when they entered Paris was a provisional government grouped around the Senate, grouped around the masses of granite and the old political elites, the immortals, who had simply fired him. And it was them, not him, they chose to treat with. It doesn't really matter if Napoleon always remained a Corsican, a species of Italian. Perhaps he didn't. But it does matter that he never quite became a Gaul. His certain idea of France was never quite that of the French. Thank you very much. Thank you.